I was not planning on facing my potential demise when I started on my stroll, that chilly late December night. My intention was no more than to find something to quench my very pregnant wife's cravings, along with some desperately needed solitude for myself. I don't mean to sound insensitive by any means. I do love my Christine very much. I think I fell for her within the first few moments of the initial meeting that brought us together. I had been alone for many years before my friends took it upon themselves to arrange the blind date. I had never cared for such things, but even an introvert such as I could be consumed with loneliness from time to time. She was truly a delight to be around, and it amazed me to find that we had so much in common. I consider myself to be of fairly unique taste, and it has always been difficult for me to form relationships. My small circle of friends had been in my life for what felt like centuries sometimes, but I never could have predicted they would be the ones to introduce me to my soulmate. We married within mere months of being together. I worried we were rushing things a bit, that perhaps we had not yet outgrown our honeymoon phase, but I had never been so happy in my life. Over the years, our love for each other never grew stale or predictable, and when she became pregnant, we were overjoyed at the thought of bringing a new member into the family. Unfortunately, my poor Christine endured some complications over the last few months and has found herself mostly bedridden. I have done my best to be the loving and supportive husband she has needed over this troubling time, but this has left little room for me to be alone with my thoughts, a necessity for the introverts of the world. So, when she had a late-night craving, I was more than happy to take it upon myself to head out for a spell. She was hesitant to let me leave, as it was getting quite late, and surely few stores would still be open. I assured her I would be able to track something down, but she still practically begged me to stay home. There had been a rash of killings of late in our humble little town, but the victims had primarily been brunette women, 4 dark-haired ladies, and 3 men of no distinct pattern, to be precise. Our local sheriff feared a serial killer was at large, but I presumed he had just watched entirely too many crime shows. Perhaps I was too quick to dismiss his suspicions, as well as proving a little too eager to escape the house for a bit. But I understood Christine's concerns. I promised her I would keep my phone handy should she need me, before I kissed her on the forehead and made my way out into the night. It may have been wiser for me to arm myself with something more intimidating than my trusty pocket knife, but I wasn't overly concerned. This wouldn't be the first time I had braved the brisk night air for a midnight snack for my love, and I'm sure it won't be the last. So, I left out for my stroll, leaving the snow-covered car parked. It would have obviously made my trip faster had I chosen to drive, but I wasn't the biggest fan of driving on slippery roads. Plus, the walk would allow much more time for me to enjoy a bit of solitude. Once I was far enough away from the house, I lit a cigarette. My wife wasn't exactly fond of the habit that had been a part of my life since my teen years, but that wouldn't stop me from sneaking a few in when I got the chance. This was another thing that was far rarer of late. There are worse things people do behind their spouse's back, so I wasn't exactly burdened with guilt over it. She does have an uncanny sense of smell, though. I always keep hand sanitizer and a small bottle of cologne in my jacket pocket for such occasions. Normally, on nights like these, she would be too distracted by whatever goodies I brought her to be concerned with whether or not I had snuck in a smoke or two. Within 15 minutes, I was pushing through the door of the Gas and Sip. It was a decent little convenience store, which they had all decked out in Christmas flair. I toured the snack aisle while the little drummer boy echoed from the speakers above my head. I always looked forward to hearing the festive music in the stores this time of year, though many would just have the droning elevator-style tunes for ambient, background music. Fortunately, my old buddy Eduardo, behind the counter, made sure to provide songs from his own playlists. Many gas stations wouldn't provide such things for their guests' brief visitations, but I think Ed did it more for himself than anyone else. There were only 2 other people in the store at this hour, an older gent scratching lottery tickets up front, and another guy in the back, sporting a brown hoodie and a thick winter coat. I couldn't see his face, but he appeared to be just aimlessly window shopping. I couldn't help but wonder if he was just waiting for the place to clear out so he could pull a gun on Ed, but he'd only have himself to blame when my friend would inevitably draw the 12 gauge he kept under the counter. I shouldn't just presume anyone's ill intent just because they seem to be trying too hard to be inconspicuous, but the world has become a crazy place. Finding nothing to fit my wife's cravings just right, I just delved into the snack cakes. I dropped my armful of Twinkies, ding-songs, and donuts on the counter, to which Ed chuckled. "Want some insulin to go with that?" He laughed. "May not hurt to grab a shot or two," I replied with a smile. "Chris about ready to pop?" Ed asked. "You have no idea." I laughed. We had been frequenting this gas station for some time, so Ed was more than familiar with us. He had even been by the house on the rare occasion he had a day off, but he stayed extra busy of late since his father retired. The store was family-owned, but he hoped to be able to hire a few more hands after the first of the year. God knows the poor guy needs a break. "You know that guy?" I asked, nodding my head to the man in the brown hoodie, who still stalked the rear aisle. "Never seen him before," Ed replied, handing me the double-bagged sack of goodies. "Just be safe, man," I said. "No worries, brother," my friend said with a wink, knocking the barrel of his sawed-off shotgun against the back of the counter. I just gave him a smile as I took the bulging plastic bag from him. "Merry Christmas, Ed," I said with a wave while I headed for the door. "Back at ya, man," he replied. The cold breeze practically smacked me in the face when I pulled the door open. It was almost stiflingly hot in the gas station, and I had almost forgotten how chilly it was outside. Though I was sure the snacks I had gathered would suit my own sweet tooth, I hated the idea of disappointing Christine. Even with how miserable her advanced pregnancy had been, she rarely asked for anything. The only other store that may be open at this hour was a good couple of miles away. Perhaps I would take a drive tonight after all. Having decided to return to my house to grab the car, I turned my back to the gas and sip and began my trip. I figured I'd check back in on my wife before heading back out into the cold, though I was sure she would try to talk me out of it. Still, I would be damned if I was going to let her down, so my mind was made up. I dug my earbuds out of my jacket pocket and queued up my own Christmas playlist to guide my path home. We were on our way home after watching the new Hunger Games movie. My sister Olivia was falling asleep next to me. We were all silent, listening to the radio when my dad suddenly came to a full stop. It took me a second to realize what he had seen. A small truck was blocking most of the road in front of us. "What's going on there?" Olivia asked in a sleepy voice. That's when a young woman stumbled out of the truck and walked around it to the side that wasn't in vision. Her leg seemed to be hurt. She was grabbing the side of the truck to stay in balance. My parents immediately got into helper mode, seeing a person who didn't look much older than their children. I guess she was around 20 or so. "Steven, call 911. "I'll go check if she's all right," my father said. "Maybe we should stay in the car and wait for help, honey. I've seen people tricking people into getting out of their car. We can't just sit here and wait, Mary. There might be someone even more hurt on the other side." Before my mother could say anything else, he was already stepping out of the car. My mother opened her door to follow. "Kids, lock the car and stay inside." We were stopped on a quiet road. Around us were only trees. They slowly walked towards the other side of the truck. My father called out to the stranger. After that, we didn't hear anything else. I grabbed my phone and called an ambulance. "Should we check on them?" Olivia asked after a while. "I don't know," Mom said. Before I could finish my sentence, my mother appeared from the back of the truck. Her face had lost all its color. She was walking fast and determined. When she reached the car, Olivia unlocked the doors. She sat down behind the wheel without a word. Her expression was eerily calm. "Mom?" I whispered. "What's going on? Is someone hurt?" My mother didn't respond. And suddenly she opened her mouth as wide as humanly possible and screamed from the top of her lungs. I unbuckled my seatbelt, leaned over, and grabbed her by the shoulder. "Mom? Mom? What happened?" Olivia shouted and grabbed her door handle, but before she could open it, my mother had locked all the doors. She stopped screaming and took a few breaths before she hit the gas and started driving in reverse. After we were so far away that we couldn't really see the truck anymore, she turned around and took a different road to our home. She didn't respond to us. She didn't answer any questions. We kept asking about Dad, but she said nothing. Next to me, Olivia started crying and then she took out her phone to call the police again. When we reached our driveway, my mother finally unlocked the car. Still silent, she walked straight home. Olivia and I exchanged a look of fear and shock. Then she jumped to the front of the car. "I'm going back." "You go inside." "No, I'm coming with you." Even from inside the car, we heard the shrill sound of my mother's scream coming from our house. We ignored it and kept driving until we found the road with the trees. I kept trying to call my dad the entire time, but it went straight to voicemail. There was a police car waiting, but no sign of a truck. One officer was waiting by the police car, another one was looking around the side of the road. We jumped out of the car and asked where our father was. The officer told us that they arrived a few minutes ago and that there was no sign of anyone. At first, they asked us if we played a prank on them, but when he saw our concerned faces and listened to our story, he said that they would follow us home and talk to our mother. "Don't worry, we will do anything we can to find your father," he said before we went back into the car. My entire body was trembling. I had never in my life experienced anything this frightening, and I couldn't stop thinking about my dad. I hated that he didn't listen to my mom's concerns. When we reached our house, the lights in the kitchen were on. The officers followed us inside. My mother wasn't screaming anymore, but we heard the kettle in the kitchen. We followed the sound, expecting to find my mother there. I almost cried in relief when I saw that it was actually my dad. His hair was greasy and he had changed into his pajamas. "Kids, I've been worried sick about you," he said loudly, and then his gaze shifted to the two police officers. "Sir, are you all right?" "Dad, we've been trying to call you. What the hell happened?" Olivia shouted and tried to run to him, but one of the officers held her back. "I'm absolutely fine. Fantastic even. Except for the fact that I had to take a taxi home. The prices of that. Sir, we need to ask you what happened to the truck and the woman inside." My dad shook his head. "She was fine. Her car just wouldn't start, so I helped her and then she drove off. All good." "Was there anyone else with her?" My dad shook his head. "May we talk to your wife? She already went to bed, but I suppose we can wake her up." One of the officers walked upstairs with my father, while Olivia and I stayed in the kitchen with the other one and explained the situation one more time. When the other officer returned, he explained to us that my mother told the same story about the broken-down car. Apparently, my mother remembered that the stove was still on, so she quickly drove home with us. You could hear the skepticism in his voice, but there wasn't much else they could do. They gave us their number and told us to call when anything else came up or parents said anything. After they left, I went to touch the stove. It was ice cold. A little after that, my mother started screaming again. I hardly slept that night. We kept asking my mom what had happened, but she didn't answer our questions. My dad just kept telling us that everything was fine and sent us to bed. Finally, my mother stopped screaming and the house turned silent. The next morning, I walked down and heard the sound of laughter. My parents were standing in the kitchen, making pancakes without a care in the world. Olivia was already sitting by the table, staring into nothing in front of her, her expression empty. We locked eyes and I saw that she had slept just as little as I. "Morning, honey. Did you sleep well?" My mother said in a melodic voice. "Apparently everything is totally fine," Olivia said in a mocking tone towards me. I sat down next to her and my mother started stacking pancakes on a plate and walked towards me. She stopped right in front of the table and dropped the plate. The shatters flew in all directions. Suddenly her face turned pale again, her eyes were opened wide, and then she screamed again, looking at us the entire time. "Mom?" Olivia jumped up from her seat and grabbed her shoulders. "Everything is all right, love," my father calmly said. My mother blinked and looked at the ground. Her face relaxed. "Oh, won't you look at that? What a mess," she said and smiled at us. We went through the strangest breakfast we ever had. Olivia and I had stopped asking them what was going on. We didn't get answers anyway. Their attempts to distract us were only frustrating and scaring us more. After breakfast, I followed my sister to her room. Olivia was only a year younger than me, and we'd always been very close. I don't know how I would have dealt with this situation without her. We were both afraid of and for our parents. "What do we do?" she asked after I sat down on her desk chair. "I don't know. Should we call someone? Uncle Freddie maybe?" We didn't have many relatives that lived nearby. Uncle Freddie was the only one, and he was still an hour's drive away. Not sure if he can do anything. They are acting like everything is normal. Except when Mom screams, Olivia said, and a shiver went down my spine at the thought of it. Something happened with that truck. "I just wish they would tell us," my sister whispered. "Me too. And Dad is acting even stranger. He doesn't even acknowledge her screams." We both sat there for a moment, lost in our thoughts when we heard the door downstairs close shut, and a little later the car started running. Olivia looked out the window. It's Dad. So Mom's alone downstairs? We quietly walked down the stairs and made our way to our living room. My mother was sitting on the sofa. In her hand, she held a needle and yarn, but she wasn't moving. She looked completely spaced out. When she noticed us, she slightly moved her face towards us. Her mouth opened, but this time she didn't scream, she just kept it open. I walked over to her and sat down on the ground in front of her. Please, Mom. Talk to us. I don't know if you're trying to protect us from something, but this isn't helping. We're old enough and we are here for you. What happened last night? She blinked and then shook her head as if she was just waking up from a daydream. Her mouth closed again. Her eyes went to me and then to my sister. It's hard to remember. Something keeps blocking my memories. I know that something isn't right, but it's almost as if my mind keeps falling asleep. I can't control it. Olivia came closer and sat down beside me. Maybe we should take you to a doctor. I mean, the screaming really scares us, Mom. My mother looked confused. What screaming? I swallowed. Do you remember anything about that woman? We lost her. Her eyes opened wide. For a moment it looked as if she was smiling, but then her mouth opened so much that her face got all wrinkly. From the looks of it, it was as if she was screaming, but this time no sound came out. I just grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. Finally, her expression softened. Her eyes and mouth closed for a moment. She looked at the terrified faces of my sister and me. Then she tightly grabbed my arm. She wasn't a woman. I don't know what she was. It all happened so fast. But kids, a tear rolled down her cheek. I saw your father die. I don't know who that man is that came back to us. Dread filled my entire body. It felt as if a dark blanket was falling over us. I heard my mother's words, but I just couldn't believe her. I didn't want to. Suddenly, I heard the door slam shut. Olivia got up and pulled out her phone. She was just about to call an ambulance when my father walked into the room. My mother's face changed again. She was smiling, genuinely smiling. Mom isn't feeling well. I'm calling a doctor for her, Olivia said with a trembling voice. She looked at me and I saw how afraid she was of my dad. She was trying to get us out of here. My father took the phone from her hand and shook his head. No need. Your mother is fine. Everything is perfectly fine. I was actually thinking we could go to the cinema again tonight. I forced my body to get up. That sounds like a fine idea. I haven't seen the new Hunger Games movie yet. How about that one? He smiled. That sounds like a terrific idea. Yeah, I haven't seen it yet either, Olivia added. Can you get our coats from upstairs, Dad? He got up without a word and walked up the stairs. Olivia and I each grabbed one of my mother's arms. Together we quickly walked her outside and got her into the car, still wearing our pajamas and no shoes. Where are we going? My mother asked from the back seat. We're going to visit Uncle Freddie, Olivia answered in a shaky voice. But, honey, we can't just leave your dad here. He'll get lonely. During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless, chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float on the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring, but in my heart, I know they are real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute to my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth, because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body, his head, his eyes, his crooked ears, but his mouth was by far the largest. "You look kind of like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy. The little robot with the big ears. You can pet and feed them, almost like a real pet." "Oh." Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity. "You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check in on me. "I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much during those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The third or fourth morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face. "I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until after your mother comes to check on you, because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged my hand. "We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway," he said. I objected at first, as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission, but Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. He then beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the second story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline. "I like to play pretend up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend that there is a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said. "But that's all a part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way you may as well just bounce on a real trampoline." I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. "Maybe some other time," I said. "I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt." Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment. "If you say so," he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box. "I want to teach you how to juggle," he said. "Here are some things you can use to practice, before I start giving you lessons." I looked in the box. It was full of knives. "My parents will kill me," I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. "I'll be spanked and grounded for a year." Mr. Widemouth frowned. "It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it." I pushed the box away. "I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air." Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. "I have something I want you to see," he said. I must have given him a weird look, because he then said, "It's safe, I promise." I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house. "This is an important path," he explained. "I've had a lot of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path, to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day, I hope to take you there." I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of our things had been packed into a moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit, despite what he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a six-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. "Early enough for you?" he asked. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends." I opened my eyes as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me, but I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belonged to children. Perhaps it wasn't the best choice to tune out the world around me. I likely should have been paying more attention to my surroundings as I traversed the snowy sidewalk to my festive melody. It was my own fault that I didn't even see it coming. Whatever it was that struck me across the back of the head immediately knocked me unconscious. I can't be sure how long I was out, but when my eyes opened back up, I found I was strapped down to a frigid, metal table in a darkly lit room. Leather belts were buckled around each wrist and ankle, and my coat and shirt had been removed. It was freezing, to the point I could see my shaky breath exiting my mouth while my heart thumped so hard. I could see my chest bouncing. After a moment, fluorescent lights flickered on above me, causing my eyes to burn slightly. "Wasn't sure if anyone else would be out this late," a voice said from behind where I lay. "I was about to settle for the old guy before you walked in," he continued as he strolled around the metal table. He pulled down the brown hood to reveal a thin face with dark beard stubble. I'd say he was maybe early 30s at most, thick, shaggy hair, long pointy nose, pale skin, and immaculate white teeth. From what I could tell, he appeared taller now than he had at the convenience store, but that could just be the effect of my being strapped down to a slab close to his waistline. Didn't want to grab the guy behind the counter, he'd likely be missed. Plus the security cameras would surely catch me dragging him out. "Ain't never seen you before, though," he said, nonchalantly as he unlocked the large closet at the back of the room. The double doors opened up to reveal an assortment of especially nasty-looking bladed weapons. Some were long and curved, some short and serrated, but all of them looked sharp enough to slice through a Thanksgiving turkey with little to no resistance. Were I to wager a guess, my body would be taking the place of the traditional birdie in this case. "Ain't as easy to snatch folks up this time of year," the stranger, who was now slipping out of his padded coat, said. "May have to move to a more populated town soon, you know?" He continued, unzipping the hoodie. I tried to keep moving. Ain't too smart to linger anywhere for too long, with hobbies like mine. He laid the hoodie over the desk that sat against the rear wall while reaching for the apron that hung on the inside of the cabinet door. Couldn't resist trying to get one more before the end of the year. He tied the apron lace around his waist before studying the contents of his well-armed closet. Being Christmas and all, I'll show you a bit of compassion. What do you say? He asked, turning to face me for the first time since our, introduction. Want it quick and easy, or want me to take my time a bit? He was speaking as casually as if he was asking what side I wanted to go with my burger. Can I think about it for a while? I asked, shrugging as much as I could while strapped to a cold-ass table. That's a big no, partner, but can't blame you for trying. He replied, bursting out laughing at the end. Worth a shot, I sighed. So, he continued, drying his eyes with the back of his hand, still chuckling slightly. What's it gonna be? I adjusted my head as much as I could, to look the man in the face. His dark eyes had a certain hunger behind them. I thought I may attempt to stall him a little, at least give me some extra time to come up with some semblance of a plan to get out of this. I can't say I'm pressed for time, or anything, I replied. I'm sure my wife is getting worried by now, but I assume you're not planning on letting me head home anytime soon. Of course, I imagine it's safe to say that taking your time a bit, as you said, I waved my fingers in air quotes, which were far less effective while strapped down, would be a good deal more painful for me, though I would think far more satisfying for you. On the flip side, I continued, what you call quick and easy is sure to kick my bucket far sooner than I'd like, so. You gonna drone on all night? He whined, interrupting my train of thought. Well, it's a relatively big decision, I reasoned. Jesus Christ. Just gimme an answer, or I'm gonna choose for ya. He belted out. He was glaring at me with his hands on his hips and head tilted to the side. It felt similar to the time I accidentally chucked the baseball through the windshield of my dad's truck. But I'm not angry, just disappointed sort of look. The idea of someone I presumed to be a serial killer being let down by my actions almost made me feel like giggling a bit. Well, he yelped. I don't know, I retorted. What would you choose? Huh, he said, instantly calming from his previously aggravated state while forming an expression that almost resembled a poor attempt at a Robert De Niro impersonation. Guess I never really thought about it from the other side of the table. He grabbed the armrest of the chair which rested in front of the desk and glided it across the floor to my bedside. He rubbed the back of his neck while taking a seat next to where I lay. I mean, I get what you're saying now, he said. It really is a tricky situation. Right. I replied, feebly shrugging again. Sure, quick wouldn't hurt nearly as bad, wouldn't do a whole lot for me either. To tell you the truth, he continued, showing almost exaggerated effort on his face. Slow would definitely not be a walk in the park for you, but I'd sure as shit have a good time. He was rubbing his hand across the stubble on his chin. That way is a hell of a lot more tiring too, and it's been a long friggin' day. We glared at each other, each of us puzzling over both sides of the equation. It's a conundrum, he said, shaking his head with a half smile. A dilemma, even, I remarked. I grabbed my backpack and ran out, not looking back. I just ran, not knowing where I was going. I ran knowing that I couldn't go back. Tears flowed down my eyes and my chest felt like it was going to drop out my ass. I must have pissed myself because my pants were wet. I ran through the streets, past the school, past the town, into the woods. The sun had already gone down and the night took over, creating an eerie path on the outskirts of town. I didn't care. I ran through the trees, going off the path, finally stopping when I had no air left in my lungs. My legs collapsed and I sat against a tree. The wind blew against my face, and for the first time throughout that entire run, I realized I was utterly alone, not just in these woods. I had no family, I had no friends, I had no one. I wanted to not exist anymore. For a moment, I wondered what it would have been like to die, to not be me, until something shuffled amongst the leaves. I got up and looked out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing until I heard the shuffling again. It was Oregon, so perhaps it was a bear or an animal moving about. The shuffling was heavy, shuffling and steps being taken by something big and bigger than me. I tiptoed in the dark to try to find the path. I was mortified, with no flashlight or even the moon to help. I was blind. I heard the shuffling again, except closer. My heart was like an engine failing. I couldn't breathe. I kept walking, knowing that whatever the hell was shuffling in that darkness knows I was there. It was when I felt a hand on my shoulder that I started to run. I didn't know if I was going the right way or if I going deeper into the forest, but I ran. As much as I hated my parents, I would gladly go back to my crazy mother than be in the woods with something I couldn't see. Luckily, I was going the right way as I heard a car drive by. I made it back to the road, but I could still feel whatever it was in that wood behind me. I waved at the car driving, screaming for help. I took a rock and threw it at the car. It smashed a window. The car stopped and reversed. "Help me!" I screamed. The car pulled over and a man wearing a red plaid shirt with a long grimy beard got out of the car. "Help!" I yelled. "What do you think you're doing, you little shit?" he screamed, examining his car. "There's something after me," I yelled. "I don't know. Look what you did, you little shit. There's someone out there following me, please," I pleaded. "You better hope your parents can pay for this or I'll chop off your balls as payment," he screamed. The grimy bearded man grabbed me by my neck and slammed me against the car. "Or maybe I should do it now," he said. His breath smelled like beer and rotten cheese. He was missing a tooth on the left side of his mouth. I turned away, terrified. Before he could strike me, I fell to the ground. Something dragged the bearded, grimy man away from me. "Kid, get the gun in my car," he yelled at me, blood coming from his nose. The night of Christmas Eve 2008 is a blur. Depending on how much medication I am given that day, I can avoid the nurses for a couple of hours, but not too long. I suppose you've heard about me in the papers or on your favorite serial killer show. No, I was never convicted. What the media claimed was all lies anyway. No one knew what happened that night except me, which is why the police blamed me. My name is Max and my name is all I carry now. You've probably heard of ghost towns around the US. My town is one of them, located in the foggy mountains of Oregon. Most people have never heard of the town Asher. It was the kind of town where people never left, and if they did, they always returned. Things and people always had a habit of coming back. Bad memories, sadness, pain, and grief always stuck around, festering at night right before one tried to go to bed, piling on itself, growing deeper in the dirt. There are forests, but not as many trees as you'd think we would have. Green doesn't grow in this town. The dirt won't let it. No matter how much sage you burned, it couldn't cleanse this place. This town was haunted, but perhaps the people were first. I don't consider myself haunted. I just think I was born wrong. When I was brought into this world, my mother told me that I wasn't like other babies. I had a solemn-looking face and dark eyes. She also said that I refused to cry. I still can't cry. My eyes won't produce tears. The doctors say it's a disorder. Even when my grandmother died, I never cried. Or when my mother would scream at me, I never flinched. Or when my dog got hit by a car. Nothing. I didn't feel things like other kids or people. I don't feel at all. When I was 6, I knew something was wrong when I accidentally cut half my finger off and I never screamed. There is something within me that isn't in other people. I guess it was destiny for the events that took place. Some kind of fated magic. Whenever my mother got drunk, she would tell me that I was a stone boy and that all stone boys went to hell. She was bipolar when she wanted to be. When she loved me, she loved me. But when she despised the fact that she had a kid, she hated me. There was never an in-between. My father was too busy pretending nothing was wrong, with his head in the clouds of denial. He always knew how to make himself feel better. All he had to do was look away or leave the house. Too bad I couldn't live in those clouds with him. Instead, I was always on my own, sitting in silence at the kitchen table, staring out the window in the back seat of our car, waiting for some better day to come. But better days never came. 2008 was a year of many things for me. I had started 8th grade and was finally 1 year from high school. My voice got significantly deeper and life seemed like it had possibilities, until my parents separated. The separation made my home life worse. My mother drank more and my father never came home. The teachers blamed me for not paying attention, but what they didn't know was that I hadn't eaten in 2 days. The school bully would make fun of my ribs and call me names. We called him Dan. The giant, at almost 6 feet at 13 years old. He was monstrous. The only person scarier than him was his father. His dad was taller than him and viler. Even the teachers were scared. Dan had dyslexia too, but he wasn't that bright. To begin with, any kid that mentioned or corrected him got the beating. Any kid that existed, to be honest, got a beating. Dan stuck gum in my hair the Friday before winter break. The teacher had to cut chunks of my brown curly strands to get it out. My father blamed me, saying I deserved it because I refused to stick up for myself. How the hell was I supposed to stick up to a 6-foot behemoth? They would all get theirs. I promised myself, one day, they would get it, this whole town. The teacher had us all do an exercise. She called it Santa's magic. We had to write a letter to Santa asking what we wanted the most. The other kids laughed. We all knew Santa Claus wasn't real. For a moment, I believed. Because I had nothing else to believe in, I asked Santa for something very important, something I've wanted for a long time, something only Santa could give me. I was making a can of soup when my mother stumbled through the kitchen, knocking the bowl out of my hand. "Pick it up," she yelled, not wanting to get hit. I found some towels and soaked up the liquid. My father looked down at me from the living room without saying a word. Instead, he took his coat and left. God, I hated my parents. They were pieces of cow crap and they knew it. The whole town knew who my mom was by the bars she would frequent and lose her clothes in. Dan the Giant once told the class that my mother was nothing but a no-good whore and my father a loser mechanic. That was the day I punched Dan. Of course, he punched back and harder. Neither of us got in trouble. The principal didn't want to get involved. That was the thing with the town of Asher. No one wanted conflict, and yet there was always conflict. No one wanted to get involved, yet everyone usually was. I put the soaked up towels in the basement and went to mop the floor. I was angry because that was the last can of soup. No one went food shopping anymore, and when something did pop up, usually someone took it and hid it. I scrambled through the cabinets for anything else I could find. There was nothing. I teared up, my stomach growling, and I drank a glass of water to appease the pain. My mother sat in the corner of the kitchen with her bottle, laughing. "Where did your father go?" she asked, stuttering over her words. "I don't know," I responded. "One day I'm going to leave this earth and never come back. Then what are you all going to do?" She laughed again. "You're just like your father, small, weak, and pitiful. I didn't want you, but he made me keep you," she chided. "I never wanted kids, but there you were one day, a mistake." "Stop," I muttered under my breath. "Or what?" my mother replied, vicious as ever. My father came back through the door. He took one look at my mother and went upstairs to his room. "The kids in the town say you're a whore," I screamed. My mother got up from the ground as quickly as she fell back over. "What the hell did you just call me?" "My friends say you're nothing but a dirty whore." My mother reached into the drawer and grabbed a knife. "You piece of shit, how dare you dare call me that? How do you think I pay for this place?" "Your father, who hasn't had a job in months. Your weak and useless father, weak and useless. And you know what? You're just like him." She screamed. My mother took another swing at the bottle and then at me. "Just get out. Get out. Get out of my house. Get out," she screamed. I went into his truck and found a revolver under the seat. I could hear something attacking the bearded man, the thing from the woods. I could hear the tearing of flesh and the breaking of his bones. I grabbed the man's phone that had dropped on the ground and put it on flashlight mode. The man was dragged into the woods, screaming, leaving a bloodstain on the road behind. I screamed and went into the car, locking the doors. I didn't know how to drive a car, but I figured it out. I put my foot on the brakes and out the gear and drive. Even though I put my foot on the gas, the car wouldn't move. Whatever creature took that man came back. This time, for me, it was holding the car from the back. I got out and started running back through the dark. I tried to call 911 on the dude's cell phone, but something knocked it out of my hand, smashing it to the ground. I stopped, feeling the creature circling me. I prepared myself to be torn apart like the grimy bearded man. Instead, I felt a stale breath on my neck. I turned around, not seeing anything. I knew it would be any moment before it killed me. I closed my eyes and waited, my hand raised on its own. Whatever this creature was, held my hand and grasped it. Holding it, I shakily lifted the light from the cell phone to its face. It was ugly with white, pale, and scaly skin. Its mouth was oversized, with teeth that protruded from its bloodied mouth. A long, slippery tongue occasionally stuck on the way a snake's tongue feels the environment. It was tall, and had black coal eyes that gave a merciless stare. "What are you?" I asked. The cold eyes looked into mine, but it gave no response. Thank you, I muttered. I felt an ice droplet on my nose. It started to snow. I didn't know what this thing was, but it decided that I would call it Creature. Creature cried into the night. Its shrieks echoed in the air. I was still scared, but something felt safe with it. It did save me from that man. Are you alone, too? I asked. It shook its head. Whatever Creature was, it understood me. The creature took one last look at me and ran into the woods, disappearing into the trees. I ran home and away from what would be a future crime scene. I was terrified, confused, but also curious. I opened my front door quietly, hoping that no one was awake, and tiptoed to my bedroom. The next morning, the entire town was talking of bears, thieves, or wild animals that must have taken Burton John A.K., the grimy bearded man. That was his name, only I knew what happened to Burton, and he was definitely dead. I guess Creature took the body and finished it off elsewhere. My mother left me alone the next day, perhaps out of guilt. My father never asked me how I was. I quickly got dressed and went off to school. I didn't notice the dirt in my hair left over from last night. Dan the giant made jokes to the class about how poor my family was, that we couldn't afford water, and that we were all dirty people. I ignored him, but he just wouldn't stop. For an entire 30 minutes, he kept going, unable to control himself. The teacher sat at her computer drinking her coffee, living in her clouds of denial, and pretending nothing was wrong. Then the thought came to me. How interesting would it be to have Creature eat Dan? It was murder, I quickly realized, and I was not a murderer. Dan kept going for the rest of the class period. Something changed in me. I realized Dan didn't deserve mercy. He deserved to get eaten. He was a piece of shit, and he would eventually grow up to be a shit adult. People like him never grew out of their shitness. Kids like Dan either became violent men that preyed in bars or violent cops that preyed on civilians. No one would miss him. Remembering the gum in my hair, and I knew that something had to be done. He had to be punished. We all got let out early for Christmas Eve. I skipped the bus and walked back down to where Creature was. Police and townies were all over the woods. There was no way I would be able to find him. I went back home. My mom was going through one of her cycles where she bought food, cooked dinner, and acted like she didn't just kick me out the other day. This happy cycle only lasts a couple of hours before someone says or does something that tips the scale and she's full-blown crazy again. I took the opportunity to eat and go to my room. Not more than an hour later, after my father mentioned that the gas got turned off, did she tip. I started packing a bag for myself. I put on my shoes and left for the front door. I wanted to get ahead of the storm and look for Creature. The second I opened it, my mother's hand slammed it shut. Where the hell do you think you're going? She asked. Why do you care? I snapped back. You're not going anywhere. I'm not going to sit in this house as you hit and yell at me. I'll just leave. My father walked by us, slinking up the stairs to his room. Mom, I'm leaving. She grabbed me by my throat. Tell me what you're going to do again. I couldn't breathe. She took a shoe and hit my leg with it. It's your fault we can't pay the bills. All you do is take from us. You're lucky we don't put you out into the street. I felt my lungs tearing inside from the pain. I was a minute from passing out when a loud crash through the window made my mother let go. I didn't have to look for my friend after all, because there it was, in my living room. It walked on the broken glass unhurt like Jesus on water. It ran to my mother and grabbed her and threw her across the room. My father came downstairs and, upon seeing Creature, ran for his gun. Creature was too fast. It slit my father's ankles and he fell down the stairs. Creature put its foot on top of my father's stomach until it protruded, squishing and disemboweling him. My mother tried to run, but Creature threw a table at her, stopping her. Please. Take him. Take him, she pleaded, pointing at me, tears rolling down her eyes. Creature wrung her neck, and with one final snap, crushed it. Blood poured from her eyes and nose. I sat in silence looking at what it had done to my parents, the two people that raised me from when I was a baby, my parents who loved me, beat me, and told me I was scum and hated me for existing. I felt nothing for them as I looked upon their bloodied faces. I suppose it was at that moment that something else changed. I took Creature's hand and we left my house. We found an old Santa's costume and I dressed him, a red hat and a red and black suit. He just wanted to belong like me. Santa had finally come to the town of Asher. We started at my neighbors' houses, one by one, killing them all, their screams like a symphony in the night. I watched as he pulled organs out, smashed people's heads, picked out teeth, and splattered blood on Christmas trees. Oh, how the red brightened the magical night. When we reached Dan's house, I knew I wanted to relish the moment when he saw who was behind his death. Creature slashed Dan's father's throat and with its sharp claws, stabbed his mother. Dan screamed in horror as Creature inched closer to him. I smiled at Dan, who looked back with a face I'll never forget. To be honest, it was a look of defeat. Creature took Dan and limb by limb, tore him apart. His agony was my cloud of denial and his suffering my alcohol, and I was drunk in it. When we were done, I watched Creature feed on some of the bodies, offering me chunks of eyeball, brain, and liver. I wondered where this beast had come from, but it didn't matter. He was my friend and he answered my one Christmas wish, a wish only Santa could give. Before the night had ended, Creature took one last look at me, but I somehow knew he wasn't coming back. There was no ceremonious farewell. This beast went back into the darkness from where it came, and I didn't even feel sad. My friend was gone, and I still felt nothing. You see, I just wanted to be alone. When the news hit that a town massacre had occurred, the world was in shock. The only survivor was a 14-year-old boy. I told the police no lies that night. I told them that Santa Claus had come to town.